little bit about what exactly these proposals are. What do we want? Why have they not received the kind of attention that we believe they need to receive? And how can Africa speak with one voice in championing this critical agenda? So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to the President and Chairman of the Board of Directors for the African Export-Import Bank, Professor Benedict Orama.
Welcome to Kenya for the Africa Climate Summit from the 4th to the 6th September 2023. See you all in Nairobi.
William Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya. Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, the Chairperson of the African Union. Excellency, Heads of State. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking the government and people of Kenya under the leadership of His Excellency President William Ruto for the wisdom of hosting this very important event and granting me the honor of moderating this high-level panel. The key message of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord was that no country should have to choose between fighting poverty and fighting for the planet. The Paris Summit identified a critical role finance will play in ensuring this. Extensive commitments on climate financing were made there. 8 years since Paris, Africa and many developing countries have no resources to fight neither poverty nor the climate challenges that we face every day. The problem, though, hasn't been a deficit of ideas and suggestions, but rather the lack of action on the part of almost all stakeholders. Whether it is the pledge of G7 leaders to commit $100 billion climate finance, or the Bristol Initiative calling for international lenders and multilateral development banks to become more adaptive and innovative in structuring loans and debt servicing for countries affected by climate disasters, or caused by developing economies for the reform of the G20 Common Framework to give voice to the global South. The challenge remains the difficulty of moving from words to action. It is estimated that Africa will require about $200 billion per annum to achieve SDGs by 2030. Another $160 billion will be required for African countries to pursue loss and damage mitigation and adaptation, implying a combined annual cost of pursuing a climate-efficient development of over $350 billion. When you add the money needed for infrastructure of over $100 billion, you can begin to imagine the level of financing that is required. And the question had always been, who will bear the cut? Who will fund the gargantuan cost? We find ourselves in quite a unique situation today. A situation where the economies that are responsible for the most emissions, in a cumulative and static sense, are also the wealthiest. That scenario makes it easier to apply the principle of burden sharing that recognizes the degree of contributions to emissions and the level of access to resources in the distribution of responsibilities. Therefore, we must call on developed economies and G20 economies in general to honor their commitments to developing nations towards climate finance. Nonetheless, in the absence of firm global action, Africa has not been sitting on its palms, especially because it is the continent that suffers the most from the loss and damage inflicted by climate. It is the continent that needs to adapt to the changes we are beginning to see. So things are being done, even at a very small scale. For instance, Afreximbank and Africa Risk Capacity have jointly created an insurance product that protects African economies from food insecurity that arises from climate disaster risks. Afreximbank finances the premium and provides food import finance and co-guarantee to Africa Risk Capacity, while Africa Risk Capacity fronts the provision of the insurance capacity. Funding at just $1 billion for this product, you will agree with me that this is grossly underfunded. There is therefore a scope for the World Bank, the multilateral development banks in general, capital-rich economies to step in by providing capital to this fund as a way of meeting their loss and damage obligations. A global carbon tax, which His Excellency President Ruto emphasized on today, can also be a major source of funding for the climate insurance program. Money from that can be used to subsidize the insurance that countries may pay to buy this climate disaster insurance. Afreximbank has also launched a $2 billion climate adaptation facility, a product we co-conceived with the government of Kenya under President Ruto. And this product provides facilities that makes it possible for countries to engage in adaptation projects in a way that does not lead to additional sovereign debt, leveraging public-private partnerships. The first transactions will be done here in Kenya, and we expect to replicate those transactions in the Sahel and other parts of the continent. While these are tangible proposals and initiatives, political leadership and collective will are paramount to breaking the course of water development and fighting climate disaster. This high-level panel of key leaders will aim to provide the political guidance needed as we prepare to make an even stronger case at the upcoming COP28 in the United Arab Emirates later this year. I'm sure that our distinguished panelists will bring greater illumination to these issues and more. This context, it is my singular honor to now welcome our esteemed panelists. Let me begin by inviting our host, His Excellency President William Ruto, to please come up to the podium to take his seat. His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana. His Excellency Mustafa Madbouli, Prime Minister of Egypt. Her Excellency Francia Marquez, Vice President of Colombia. His Excellency Dr. Sultan Jeba, COP28 President and Honorable Minister of the UAE, His Excellency Sigrid Kaag, Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Sorry, High Excellency. Thank you again, and on your behalf, let me welcome our panelists once more. Since this morning, we've had quite extensive discussions and presentations on ideas about what to do to make sure that we move from discussion to action, especially with regard to climate finance. So let me begin by asking host, President Ruto, what he should consider to be the key elements of global climate finance architecture that we should all be aiming at, especially when we get to UAE for COP28.
Thank you very much, Professor Orama. As I said this morning, how do we move from potential to opportunity? And how do we turn the opportunities we have into jobs, into investments, and into industrialization, manufacturing, and growth? That's really what we need to do. And front and center is the big elephant. Where is the money going to come from? How are we going to finance our transition from opportunity to growth? In my opinion, there are three areas that we need to focus. Number one, we need to focus on where do we find money or resources or financing, number one, at scale, and number two, that is affordable, and number three, that is accessible. And that is why we have insisted that while we appreciate the contribution of our multilateral development institutions, the current financial architecture to support our progress, what they are doing is good, but it is insufficient because our current challenges are compounded. We're not dealing with a normal situation. We're not dealing with the situation for which these institutions were built. And therefore, it is important for us to realign our sources of financing with the realities of the moment. The moment we need a scale-up of development resources. And that is why we are speaking about scale. At the moment, we need to make sure that these resources are available at rates that are friendly to the investments we want to make. And therefore, in my very honest opinion, the reform of the multilateral development banks will achieve two things. And when we talk about reform of multilateral development banks. Some of those banks, whether it is IMF or World Bank, we are shareholders. So legitimately, these are our institutions. And therefore, we need to deal with how do we make these institutions of ours much more fit for purpose? How do we make them fit for purpose? So, number one, we think like we did with COVID, when there was some creativity and innovation that resulted in special drawing rights. We think that there is scope in that window of special drawing rights to meet the challenges that we have of the moment of energy transition. What we would want done differently this time is that the manner in which these resources are allocated should be different, where those who need it most get it, while those who need it least don't have to get a lion's share of what they don't need. That's number one. Number two, we believe also creatively and in an innovative manner, there is scope for us to use and leverage the balance sheets of these institutions. And I must do a disclaimer. I am not a financial person. I am a scientist. But I am very confident that we have very intelligent people. We are not short of good economists and analysts and financial people that we can do to leverage the balance sheets of these great institutions. And that is what my sister Motley is talking about, the Bridgetown Initiative. How do we raise an extra $500 billion every year, or at least in 5 years, to be able to do what we must do with energy transition? And finally, I think the other option that we need to have a conversation about is carbon tax. This is a very controversial thing, but it is the right thing to have the conversation about. However controversial it may be, I mean, we need to have a conversation about carbon tax. If we are to raise the scale of resources needed for energy transition, we must have a conversation about carbon tax. In fact, the numbers speak to it. The IMF has actually done a lot of work around it. And they have told us it is possible to raise 870 billion shillings from carbon tax. The only problem that IMF is pointing to us is that there is insufficient political will. And there are challenges with political will. Surely, faced with an existential threat to humanity, aren't we able to muster the political will to achieve this? And let me give one more thought around it. The EU Parliament has already considered FTT, the financial transaction tax, as a means of raising resources to deal with climate change. And in fact, they've gone all the way to their parliament. So the idea of a carbon tax is no longer remote. We must have it firmly on the table. And finally, Professor, we are making these suggestions because we are practical. We are dealing with practical situations. As I said this morning, 9 countries have already gone off the cliff. Many are on the way there to debt distress because of high interest rates and because of climate change. Unless we deal with it, and let us not imagine that we are sorted, especially because when we were in Paris, admittedly, there were found ways of dealing with countries that have been already in default. But the question we ask ourselves, do we have to wait until countries have gone to default to sort them out? Isn't it possible for us to sort them out ahead of the cliff? And that is the conversation we are having. And let me conclude by saying that this time round, we're going to be firmly on the table. It doesn't matter how uncomfortable this conversation is. It doesn't matter who we annoy. We are going to be here until we are heard and until the right thing happens.
No, thank you very much. Let me go to Chairperson Musafaki. Chairperson, you just heard what President Ruto said. As we form the views as a continental view, from the African Union's perspective, what should we be expecting? What is the African Union's views and strategy to make sure that all these ideas that we are forming here find their way into implementable actions when the COP28 convenes? Thank you.
Merci, professeur Orama. J'ai écouté effectivement attentivement le président Ruto.
President Ruto,
Je l'en remercie.
and I thank him.
Je le remercie pour son plaidoyer fort,
I thank him for his strong advocacy, his leadership,
mais aussi et surtout
but also and particularly
l'action concrète
for the concrete
qu'il a mis.
proposals that he has put on the table.
La situation de l'Afrique est connue.
The situation of Africa is well
Les
known.
défis auxquels
The challenges faced by the continent are known.
les attentes qu'il nourrit
And
sont
the
connues.
expectations that are nurtured
Son potentiel
are
très
known.
important est connu.
Its important potential also
Les
is
promesses
known.
à lui faites sont également
The promises made to Africa are also known.
Il y a une importante littérature sur la question.
There is a lot of literature on this matter.
Maintenant, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire?
Now, what should we do? This is the question.
Il faut d'abord accepter la spécificité.
First, we have to accept the specific nature of the continent. 600 million Africans don't even have electricity. It is a continent which is under-industrialized, and then is being asked here and now to bring about ecological transition. President Macky Sall earlier was saying that we need to follow the rhythm and peculiarity of this continent.
Tout ceci ne pourra
All this can be possible. Transition, yes, it is important,
encore, il faut créer les conditions pour
but
que cela
we
soit.
need to establish the necessary conditions for it to become possible.
L'Afrique ne vient pas,
Africa is not coming empty-handed.
elle est un réservoir.
It is a reservoir.
Il faut se pencher sur cette question.
So I think we need to
Comment
think of that,
ce potentiel
how this important potential may be harnessed for the benefit of its peoples. This is a substantive issue.
les promesses qui sont faites,
Are the promises that have been made, including the reform of international financial institutions, and what we have seen in the past, the structural adjustment programs, which for decades had been applied
par les États africains.
by the African states. And I recall,
On parle du Tchad qui est mon
I'm
pays,
talking of Chad, my country,
même certains experts
we were asked even that certain agricultural productivity, particularly rice, they should stop production and import rice.
faut le reconnaître. Ça n'a pas marché.
It did not work. We have to admit
Ça n'a
that.
pas marché.
It did not work. Then we went to programs of the World Bank, poverty reduction. What is the result? Let's take stock. Some countries are now even poorer. And I do not exclude, and I am not condoning poor governance, and I am not excluding the responsibilities of the states, but the special drawing rights. There was some hope. Out of 650 million, we got only, and I'm really asking whether this was disbursed, 33 million or 33 billion. After a terrible pandemic like COVID, can we really have economic recovery? It is not possible. The green expect, and from this important conference, and it is very timely, so that around the table with our partners, with the financial institutions, with international organizations and the member states, since the challenge of climate change does not forgive anybody, does not distinguish between African, American or Indian. I think we are all in the same boat. Let us make sure that this boat doesn't sink. That is a real problem. I'm not a technical expert to go into the various labyrinths of how to market carbon, etc. and all. I think we cannot be just content with promises. Those that have been promises made have never been fulfilled, have never been honored. Let us ask ourselves the real question, and honestly, whether politically we have decided this time to be serious and to be consistent. And thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think with the kind of enthusiasm we've seen here, the passion and the commitments shown by our leaders, I believe that Africans have had enough. I think everybody now wants to see action because we've used many years to think and talk about what can be done. Now it is what will be done. With that, let me invite our brother Mo Ibrahim to join the panel. Mo. Yes. Well, thank you for joining us. So. And let me ask Prime Minister Madbuli, given the challenges many countries face today, the financing challenges, interest rates, debt overhang, and of course the large financial requirements for meeting the climate finance requirements, at country level and continental level and so on. What would be your suggestion on the best approach? President Afwerki mentioned we should look inwards, we shouldn't look outside. Many said we should look outside. So there are different views. The important thing is we need the money. So from your perspective, what would be the suggestion on how to find the money? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me start by stating that climate finance is undeniably the central pillar for empowering the delivery of climate goals and nationally determined contribution, or NDCs, in particular for our African continent. In this regard, allow me to summarize Egypt's vision in this respect as follows. First, climate finance constitutes a cornerstone and foundation for the full implementation of national commitments and contribution as outlined by developing countries, and to the transition to a green economy and addressing climate change issues. International agreements, including the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, clearly established a direct link between the level of financing provided to developing countries to support their efforts and the level of ambition and from backslide on the risk and goal of swift and effective implementation. Secondly, it is essential to deal with the staggering funding gap with a realistic approach and build upon current estimates to enable the implementation of the commitment declared by developing countries, which amount to around $5.6 trillion by 2030. The required investment in renewable energy alone is approximately $1 trillion annually. Likewise, the amount of international funding needed to achieve carbon neutrality amounts to about $4 trillion annually. These are the estimates required to implement the scientific recommendation to maintain the 1.5-degree target. Thirdly, this volume of financing underscores the need for a significant overhaul of international financial institutions and multilateral developing banks in alignment with the objective laid out in Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. This restructuring should be driven by three core goals: additionality, through increasing climate financing levels without impacting the funding already designated for sustainable development and poverty eradication; accessibility, through facilitating access to climate finance by developing countries without stringent conditions and other obstacles; and right finance instruments through concessional financing instruments, and removing, as His Excellency President Ruto mentioned, and removing the unfair and unbalanced rate imposed by some multilateral development banks, imposed on by debt, limited resources for adaptation efforts, the escalating cost of financing due to the interest rate surges, and the collateral requirements to entice global investment. In essence, this approach aims to prevent the deepening of the debt crisis in the developing world and the African continent. Fourthly, there is a need to transform the challenges of debt into an opportunity for innovative financing mechanisms. This includes effective mechanism for debt for climate swap, redirecting financing towards developmental and environmental projects, as well as a review of international financial institutions' policies regarding restrictions and fees on loans to developing countries. In this context, we welcome the Bridgetown initiative as a step forward in facilitating financing for developing countries facing the impact of climate change. I would like further highlight Egypt initiatives in partnership with the Economic Commission of Africa on Sustainable Debt Coalition, endorsed by African Ministers of Finance, which aim at decreasing the cost of green financing. Those initiatives contribute to the reform of the international financial architecture. We already have the support of more than 22 African countries for the Sustainable Debt Coalition and call for all African countries to join these initiatives. Lastly, it is crucial to explore innovative financing tools, including carbon market and certain fees or taxes on specific activities and economic sectors. But in doing so, and in considering such innovative sources, we need to ensure that they are in line with the international agreements and fully considering its socio-economic implications, particularly on our developing countries. At the same time, ensuring that we are refraining from any unilateral actions that might hinder the competitiveness of our African exports or our ability to attract foreign direct investments. I would like, at the end, to state that Egypt firmly believes that raising the level of ambition in the new NDCs without a corresponding increase in appropriate financing and a review of current financing mechanism will not contribute to achieving the desired goal, whether in energy transition, emissions reduction, or adaptation. It is imperative that we witness a clear shift in the policies of multilateral financial institutions and development partners in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Excellency, for that. And I think you just sent a message inviting all African countries who have not yet joined the coalition to do so. There are 22 already. I think the invitation is for the rest, 33 countries to consider joining so that you can have one voice in pushing this. So thank you. Let me go to the Deputy Prime Minister, KICC. You've heard from African leaders about their expectations, what they want from discussions that have been ongoing on financing climate. You looking from outside to inside, what is your take on that, on what they've said? What would you suggest, and what do you think the developing economies or developed economies can do to support the initiatives that have been proposed? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for President Ruto for this fantastic initiative. Actually, I don't think there are any sides. They're just different shades of the same coin and different potential affordability and accessibility. But there's one side, and that's the climate action and the urgency. Because we're one humanity, and we will all perish together, some sooner than later. But this is the stark reality. So I think from that vantage point, we've heard a lot also in recent years. We know what success looks like. The big question remains political leadership, political will. And this is where differentiation lies in, because some countries will have to do more and others will have to do less. And some might lie in between. Let me just detail this. We know we need to stand for climate justice. And this needs to be detailed in a more meaningful way so it makes sense to all. That also general audiences in Western Europe or OECD countries actually figure this out from a relative vantage of an advanced economy. We need to consider equity and urgency. Now, I'm very seized with the notion of opportunity because I think it's very big, it's equally important, and it's the only way we can drive this agenda away from being only an existentialist crisis and to keep people along with this flow. Now, the how, that's the what. The how is straightforward, technical support, but it differs per country. It can be high-level technical support, but it needs to be quick, it needs to be available, and it needs to be affordable. And very often it's still costed by the countries themselves. Here, we need to fix that. Equally so, I think we've lost a lot of time in focusing too much in a lot of agendas on mitigation as opposed to adaptation. We now know both need to happen, but we need to make up for lost time. When it comes to finance, of course, very often the elephant in the room. I've been a minister for trade and aid. I've worked a long time for the UN. The best ideas fall foul of lack of political will, or affordability and finance. The substance most can agree to. Now, on the MDBs, we really think as shareholders and as partners in this endeavor, the reforms, the capital adequacy framework reforms need to happen now. There's an institutional burden of proof and leadership at the MDBs, as well as the IFIs, as well as the shareholders. I think President Ruto said that as well. We're all in this. We own part of it. We need to make this happen. We also see potential in differentiated pricing, in hybrid capital. It's only a pilot, but let's make the pilots work and scale them up. Too much time is lost in talking about pilots that remain standalone pilots. Secondly, private sector. I've heard a lot in recent years on how the private sector is willing, and I'm fully convinced, yet they need very often the right governance framework. They need to know which partnership they are part of, and they need scalable and callable projects where governments, such as mine, can guarantee the risks. The onus should not be on the developing or highly indebted country to also guarantee the risk. This is where I think we sometimes fail to connect the dots. Now, last but not least, governments. We need to really make serious business out of onward lending of the SDRs. We also need to increase the SDRs. We need to provide the additional finance. Now, as a Minister of Finance, of course, my other hat, I'll tell you, this is not a very popular theme. Everybody nods, yes, very important. No, we agree with Mrs. Kaag. But then it's either cost cutting or it's increase of taxation or other means of financial availability. And this is where domestic audiences suddenly become reticent. This is where political will comes in, to make this a shared agenda for all of us. It's not easy, it can be done. We actually won elections on this ticket in the Netherlands last time round. I don't think we'll do as well this time, but still, it can be done. Innovation, an obvious one. Blended finance mentioned. Green bonds. We were the first AAA rated country that issued green bonds. We can assist other countries, but we also need to find ways for many of the developing countries to issue their own green bonds to also provide for the domestic resource mobilization that needs to happen as part of accountability. The sensitive topic of loss and damage, I look forward to the discussion at the COP28 because I think there's a fair claim that has been put forward. Now the negotiations will see how far we'll go. I think the political symbolism of the discussion is equally important if we talk about equity and a shared agenda. Now, last but not least, carbon tax and carbon pricing. Very, very important. Unless you price it, unless you tax it, it often has little meaning. The only way to change behavior, productivity, the way we produce and consume, particularly at the large emitting countries, is if we price it more and we make that part of a global public good. But that's part of a discussion. Last but not least, together with my friend and colleague, Minister of Finance of Indonesia, I co-chair the Global Coalition of Ministers of Finance for Climate Action. So a 1-second pitch, all Ministers of Finance, if not in the room, join this coalition. Make your budgets work for climate action. This is where the duty and opportunity of care lies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the illuminating comments. I see there is no actually night and day between what the African leaders are saying and what you've said. Let me now go to Francia, the Vice President. From Colombia, from Meru, and then exported to Colombia. So, we share the same heritage, and incidentally, the same problems. We understand ourselves. We understand the burden we are carrying. We understand the challenges the climate has posed on us. So, looking from where you are inside and listening to our leaders and also the Prime Minister from Netherlands, what would be your suggestion, especially from your experience in Latin America and the Caribbean? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
In the first place, I must say that Latin America and the Caribbean are experiencing the pressures of powerful economies that want to continue exploiting our natural resources. And this pressure of exploiting our natural resources contribute to increasing the climate crisis. There are very few the governments who are taking up the decarbonized economy, an economy that makes a transition and a transformation in this matter. In low-income countries, the vulnerable countries, or the middle-income countries like the Latin American countries, this is a great challenge because we have based our economy on extraction. We have based our economy on carbon, to coal. In my country, we are the first alternative government, and we are creating a change in the laws and also a change of paradigms, in the social paradigms, because we have to create awareness that contributing to the exploitation that accumulates capital but does not generate well-being and that destroys the ecosystem is not a path that we accept. In this sense, we want to make a transition, and as I had said before, we have serious problems, serious financial problems, which in some way do not allow us to resolve the challenges of the effects of the climatic crisis. But in the case of Colombia, we have a conflict, a social conflict, an armed conflict, a war which we are experiencing, which contributes to exacerbate this situation of vulnerability in our country. And in this sense, I think that we have an increase of the debt with very high interest rates that do not allow that within our country we can have the necessary resources to invest in these proposals for energy transition and actions for mitigation and adaptation to the climate change. This will not change if we continue with the current financial system, as I have said, which has a colonialist point of view. The financial system, the international financial system that we have today is one that does not allow justice, social justice, and neither does it allow for climatic justice. In our countries, the basic needs are not satisfied. So, and there are lots of needs. We are one of the countries where there are the most inequalities in the planet. Sometimes we have to not invest socially in drinking water, in health, in electricity, and connectivity in order to use these resources from the treasury to pay the external debts, which, as I was telling you, has very high interest rates with respect to countries which do not have the same conditions that we have. In this sense, we have spoken about exchange of debt for climate action with new rules, not the same traditional rules, because this problem, which is not a traditional way of carrying out things, we have to innovate with new actions, new rules, the financial system today does not help us to face the challenges of climate change. It's not a system that was created for us, and it's not a just system for our countries. And in this sense, we have come to present a multilateral agreement because this is already a global crisis that requires a global response. And that means that as we had done during the pandemic, we can do, or maybe in this multilateral agreement, we can do what was done during the pandemic to issue special rights that can allow the vulnerable countries and the middle-income countries to generate conditions of flexibility in regard to their debts and to free resources to invest in our lands, in our communities, in our nations. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible to care for this situation. This is a proposal which President Gustavo Petro has presented to the world, and we agree with President Ruto about the need to reform the financial system, the qualifiers of debt, increase the crisis, because in a catastrophic situation of our